Annunciation. The calamitous Annunciation, the address, the Annunciation. By the way, do notice only one of these Annunciations are going to be capitalized, and it will be the last one. So if the first is death is physical death, death of the body, right? There is no end but addition, the trailing consequence of further days and hours, while emotion takes to itself the emotionless, years of living among the breakage of what was believed in as the most reliable and therefore the fittest for renunciation. We have our second kind of death. This is psychological death, which leads to ennui or boredom, right? We think of the influences that Baudelaire had on T.S. Eliot. Go back to my Wasteland lecture, remember, where we read to the reader there, "You hypocrite lecteur, mon semblable, mon frère," and this notion that somehow or another life is just about wretched boredom. We have a second death. This is the psychological death that we'll be talking about, what he calls the last Annunciation. By the way, notice, what is it that leads to this horrifying boredom? Well, what was believed in as the most reliable, we begin to doubt. The ideas, of course, is that we're writing these lines while bombs, the Nazi bombs, are dropping on London and elsewhere in Great Britain, right? But this is in many ways maybe what postmodernity is defined as. The inability to believe anymore in what was most reliable. And yet, because of that, maybe this is the fittest for renunciation. And then on at line 63 and following, there is the final addition. The failing pride or resentment at failing powers. England, of course, may be a failing power when T.S. Eliot is writing these lines. The unattached devotion. We're back to the Gita 2, the Bhagavad Gita 2, of understanding you have the right to work for the work's sake only, which might pass for devotionless. Again, this word might gives us that idea of the fallibilist position as we've defined it. In a drifting boat with a slow leakage. I mean, there is a remarkable extension of W.B. Yeats' Sailing to Byzantium, where the old man speaker is in a boat sailing away, and therefore I have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium. Yeah, our speaker here says, you know, this psychological death is rough business. It's like being in the middle of the ocean in a boat. I mean, we think of Stephen Crane's Open Boat, don't we, right? But in a boat that's slowly leaking. And we're aware of it. The silent listening to the undeniable clamor of the bell of the last Annunciation. The second death, then the psychological death, is the last Annunciation. Well, if the first death is a physical and the second death is a psychological, the third death is going to be a spiritual death and a rebirth, what he will call in the end the one Annunciation. Where is the end of them? The fishermen sailing into the wind's tail. We think about the women, the ancient women who were thinking about these men. Where the fog cowers. We're back to our fog again. We cannot think of a time that is oceanless, or of an ocean not littered with wastage, or of a future that is not liable like the past to have no destination. The ocean is ever present in our mind. We have to think of them as forever bailing, the work of the sailors, of course, with the slow leak in the boat, setting and hauling, while the northeast lowers over shallow banks, unchanging and erosionless, or drawing their money, these sailors who finally are going to get back and draw their money, drying sails at dockage, not as making a trip that will be unpayable for a haul that will not bear examination. There is no end of it. This is the question, where is the end of it? There is no end of it. The voiceless wailing, no end to the withering of withered flowers. We're back, of course, to the earlier images of the two. I'm just trying to point out to you, and I realize that we're doing close reading here, and I hope that you're able to stay with me. Just notice all the ways in which Dry Salvages is a culmination. This is symphonic, yes? A culmination of the things that have been said in Bert Norton as well as East Coker, right? To the no end to the withering of withered flowers, to the movement of pain that is painless and motionless, to the drift of the sea and the drifting wreckage, the bones' prayer, to death its God, only the hardly, barely prayable prayer of the one Enunciation. Notice Enunciation here is capitalized, right? In other words, what happens is that this kind of death, first body, then psychological, and then finally this spiritual death and rebirth, leads to the sudden illumination that we're going to see at line 94, right? And then at line 87, we have a shift in tone, right? And we move to an inclusive voice of us, from us and our to we. And I think it's important to go back to East Coker, line 192. I mean, just go back there quickly and let's take a look at it for just a second. East Coker, line 192, he says it this way. Home is where one starts from. As we grow older, the world becomes stranger, the pattern more complicated of dead and living. And we pointed out how seniors often resonate with a line like this. Now take a look at line 87 of Dry Salvages. It seems, again, we're back to the fallibilist language, it seems, he's not saying this definitively, but it kind of seems this way. It seems as one becomes older, the past has another pattern and ceases to be a mere sequence or even development. The latter, a partial fallacy, encouraged by superficial notions of evolution, which becomes, in the popular mind, a means of disowning the past. Now, we've got a lot going on here in these lines. Notice that this attack on science and on evolution, this attack is very much a postmodernist movement, right, that will happen from T.S. Eliot on, right? That notion of disowning the past. In other words, if we're constantly thinking that everything is improving and evolving, then we don't have to worry so much about the past. Of course, Santayana, the great Harvard philosopher, said those who forget the past are doomed or damned to repeat it, right? The moments, line 92 and following, the moments of happiness. By the way, notice how little that word gets used, but when it gets used, it's important. The moments of happiness, not the sense of well-being, fruition, fulfillment, security, or affection. Notice the repetition of all the F sounds coming off of that word fog. Or even a very good dinner. Note the irony as well, right? What is it that in the end we have to look forward to as happiness? He says, let me tell you what happens in a postmodern world. The best thing you can look forward to is a good meal, a good dinner, right? But he says, what we really seek is the sudden illumination. And then, of course, those lines that we started our lectures with, I think it's one of the most important lines to understand what's happening in four quartets. We had the experience, but missed the meaning. Line 95. And approach to the meaning restores the experience in a different form. Think about a memory and reconfigure it in your mind. And often it's not the exact same thing that happened because, of course, we have all this other stuff that's gone on. Beyond any meaning we can assign to happiness, back to that word happiness. And then he says at line 98, I have said before, this repeating himself from East Coker, line 135, I've said before that the past experience revived in the meaning is not the experience of one life only, but of many generations. We're all connected somehow. This is a compelling idea, and I believe that Dry Salvages is really trying to drive this home. We're all connected in some way, right? Of many generations. Not forgetting, this notion of forgetting, of course, is the idea that the only sin is really to forget, right? Not forgetting something that is probably quite inevitable. Again, the fallibilist language of probably. The backward look behind the assurance of recorded history. Again, this notion that as we became scientific, we are so confident in our science. And T.S. Eliot wants to point out, yeah, I'm not so sure about this confidence that we like to give. The bombs are dropping out of airplanes. Okay, so we learned how to fly airplanes and make these bombs and dropping. I mean, how do you call this progress? Because when you drop one of these bombs, we think, of course, of the bombs that were dropped at the end of the Second World War on the two cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All the people who died, there's a lot more death and carnage than, for example, shooting a bow and arrow or a spear at somebody, right? Okay. The backward look, he says, of recorded, the backward look behind the assurance of recorded history. The backward half look over the shoulder towards the primitive terror. The argument here being made, because the river is in us and we are the sea and we are the river, we can never forget in our unconscious mind, we can never forget the primitive terror. Some have argued that this primitive terror, of course, is the ultimate terror. That is to say, Scrooge's terror, when he sees his right? We said this in our earlier lectures. When he sees that tombstone and he says, oh no, I gotta have at least one more day. Now, notice the movement here to the present, we come to discover that the moments of agony, whether or not due to misunderstanding, having hoped for the wrong things or dreaded the wrong things, is not in question, are likewise permanent. By the way, notice that the parenthetic that starts at line 107 and ends at line 109 disallows you from reading what he really says. Now we come to discover that the moments of agony are likewise permanent. That stuff in between keeps us from seeing that. In other words, we come to a realization that life is about agony, or as the Buddha said, life is about suffering, with such permanence as time has. Or is it permanent? Because it's only permanent in time. Back to the opening lines of Bert Norton. We appreciate this better. The word appreciate is important because that's aesthetic theory. We're now going to go to Aristotle and to his Poetics and to the notion of catharsis. When an audience is watching Oedipus go through his fall, fear and pity involved in all of that. We appreciate this agony better in the agony of others, nearly experienced, involving ourselves, than in our own. Our own pain, Auden says in Musée du Beaux Arts, our own pain is all we care about suffering. They were never wrong, the old masters. You can watch my lecture again on that one, right? Here he says, we have a tendency to respect agony more in others. Of course, we're thinking agony here immediately, as Christian readers of this poem would immediately think of the agony of Christ, right, and all of that. For our own past is covered by the currents of action. We're back to the Hamlet 3 soliloquy, to be or not to be. But the torment of others remains an experience unqualified, unworn by subsequent attrition. People change and smile. We're thinking now about proof rock and to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet. But the agony abides. Time the destroyer is time the preserver, and of course destroyer and preserver, hear, oh hear, the last lines of the first sonnet of Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, right? We've given a lecture on that you can take a look at. Time the destroyer and time the preserver, like the river, and here we get our simile. In other words, time is kind of like this in the way in which we respect the events of life, and so he's going to use a simile. Like the river, we're back to the Mississippi. And here an American reference has to be understood. With its cargo of dead Negroes, I'm immediately thinking of Langston Hughes, the Negro Speaks of Rivers, a poem I've given a lecture on already. Cows and chicken coops. Now some have seen this as racist language. I think it's more fair to say that what Eliot is doing is he's passing judgment on the ways in which Americans did not appreciate and respect the lives of slaves as real human beings. They're no different from, for example, cows or chicken coops that could get swallowed up into the river. The bitter apple, notice the word bitter is used immediately to follow. And the bite in the apple, and you can't read these lines without thinking of Milton and Paradise Lost, and of course Genesis 3 and the eating of the forbidden fruit. It was Milton, of course, who named that forbidden fruit as the apple in his Paradise Lost. Our Harvard Classics lectures are there if you want to go back to those. And the ragged rock, now we're directly referencing the dry Salvages, but at the same time when we read the word rock, we start to think in Christian intonations as well. Of course, Peter is the rock, Matthew 16:18, or the 2 Samuel 22, verse 2, right? The Lord is my rock. The idea of a rock, it's a powerful symbol in this second movement, right? The ragged rock in the restless waters, waves wash over it, fogs conceal it. We're back to the fogs again. On a halcyon day, halcyon, calm, idyllic. Also, of course, the word halcyon is a type of kingfisher bird. So T.S. Eliot is in his prime doing this kind of work. On a halcyon day, the dry Salvages is merely a monument. In navigable weather, it's always a sea mark to lay a course by. But in the somber season, or the sudden fury, is what it always was. In other words, the dry Salvages serves as a reference point to remind us that some nasty stuff can happen when the weather starts getting nasty. Okay, let's turn now and ask ourselves maybe some ideas here. The tone, of course, does shift in lines 87 through 125. The illumination that he's talking about, both moments of happiness and moments of agony flow together. And we're all somehow connected. It's never just your experience. We've said this many times in 303. It's never just your experience. It's never your graduation. It's our graduation. It's never your birth. It's our birth. And as Dunn will say in Meditation 17, it's never your death. It's our death. This is one of the compelling arguments against suicide, isn't it? As we've said in our lectures on Hamlet's to be or not to be speech. It's never your death. It's our death. All of us. We're all somehow interconnected. And this illumination is, that he speaks of, this sudden illumination, is in fact that. I've had students that read these lines and they say, that's powerful stuff. I see the world through my own eyes so easily. So I'm so excited to graduate. It hasn't occurred to me that I'll be sitting across the track as the balloons go up and the mascara runs, and that'll be my graduation. It hasn't occurred to me until right now to make me think, but there will be my parents who will be sitting on the other side of the track. They will also watch the balloons go up and the mascara run. Their experience of graduation will be quite different from yours, because of course they held you on the day of your birth. And now, 18, 19 years, bam, gone. They're getting older. And of course, they have a lot of fears associated with that, right? Of course, this interconnectivity, the line of all lines, Thoreau said, comes from the very Bhagavad Gita that we're going to address here in the next section. To see oneself in all being, and all being in oneself. I've had students that write that line down and they're like, man, how would that change school culture? How would that change our world? If we each had the capacity, that's the illumination that T.S. Eliot's referencing, to see oneself in all being, and all being in oneself. We're somehow all connected together. This is, again, why the agony of others, in line 111, matters. Because Aristotle says it. We are able to be reminded of the fact that we are not like other animals. We have this ability of empathy, compassion, because we're all connected in some way. Okay? Of course, the bite in the apple, think of it at line 119. This one is a selfish act, as understood by Milton. Why? Because the bite in the apple will produce all of the pain of the world. That's his answer to the theodicic question, right? By the way, for those of us who love J.D. Salinger's short story, Teddy, we know all about the apple and the biting of the apple and the vomiting up of the apple. I'll let you take a look at that short story for yourself. It's a wonderful one. Of course, the ragged rock of line 120, as we've already pointed out, that rock can be both understood as scary, because you can crash against it and die, but it can also be like a monument that's a marker as well. And of course the rock, well, in Christian theology, that is of course Peter, as we said, and some have seen this as very, very much the deity as well as God, from that 2 Samuel 22:2 passage, the Lord is my rock. All right, let's finish at 2a. This idea, of course, again, is we're all connected. At 2b, the symbol, the rock, is a powerful one here. At 3a, we mentioned already Dunn's Meditation 17. I think it works very well. And finally, at 3b, do you really feel that we are all connected in some way? Or are you more inclined to agree with Auden in Musée du Beaux-Arts that the only pain we really ever care about is our own pain? It's the only pain we can ever genuinely experience. Well, let's turn now to the central heart, in many ways, of this third poem, and that is T.S. Eliot's use of the great Bhagavad Gita. And in part 3, we're going to call this fair forward for reasons that will become evident as we get into this. By the way, this is lines now 126 to 172, or in the accumulating lines, numbering 515 to 560. Okay. Now, this is the centering movement. In all of our 4 quartets, we got this in part 3. The centering movement, and we're going to be now listening to part of the Bhagavad Gita. And so let's read along now closely again. Conquer Monkey Mind, part 3, the centering movement of Dry Salvages.
I sometimes wonder if that is what Krishna meant, among other things, or one way of putting the same thing, that the future is a faded song, a royal rose or a lavender spray of wistful regret for those who are not yet here to regret, pressed between yellow leaves of a book that has never been opened. And the way up is the way down, the way forward is the way back. You cannot face it steadily. But this thing is sure, that time is no healer. The patient is no longer here. When the train starts and the passengers are settled to fruit periodicals and business letters, and those who saw them off have left the platform, their faces relax from grief into relief, to the sleepy rhythm of 100 hours. Fare forward, travellers, not escaping from the past into different lives or into any future. You are not the same people who left that station or who will arrive at any terminus while the narrowing rails slide together behind you. And on the deck of the drumming liner, watching the furrow that widens behind you, you shall not think the past is finished or the future is before us. At nightfall, in the rigging and the aerial, is a voice descanting, though not to the ear, the murmuring shell of time, and not any language. Fare forward, you who think that you are voyaging. You are not those who saw the harbour receding, or those who will disembark. Here, between the hither and the farther shore, while time is withdrawn, consider the future and the past with an equal mind. At the moment which is not of action or inaction, you can receive this. On whatever sphere of being the mind of a man may be intent at the time of death, that is the one action, and the time of death is every moment, which shall fructify in the lives of others. And do not think of the fruit of action. Fare forward. O voyagers, O seamen, you who come to port, and you whose bodies will suffer the trial and judgment of the sea, or whatever event, this is your real destination. So Krishna, as when he admonished Arjuna on the field of battle, not farewell, but farewell.